There is something many people with avoidant attachment quietly hope for after they push someone away, yet they rarely admit it because it seems confusing, even to them. Deep inside, they often wish you would respond in a way that feels emotionally familiar, even if that familiar pattern is not healthy. That response usually reflects the emotional environment they experience with their earliest caregiver, often the person who raised them. Let me explain how this idea came into focus. During one of my weekly live sessions inside my private community, people gathered to ask questions about relationships, breakups, and the confusing behaviors that often appear in avoidant attachment. The conversations are always filled with real stories, unanswered questions, and people trying to understand why someone who once seemed so close suddenly became distant. On that particular day, someone named Ed mentioned an idea I had never heard before. He asked whether I was familiar with what he called the cat allergy analogy. I admitted I was not, and he offered to send me a detailed explanation afterward. As I read through his message, it completely changed the way I viewed avoidant behavior. He compared it to someone who has an allergy to cats. A person with that allergy does not consciously decide to sneeze, struggle to breathe, or have watery eyes. Their body reacts automatically. In much the same way, an avoidant person often does not consciously choose to feel overwhelmed when emotional closeness increases. Instead, their nervous system reacts almost instantly. Intimacy can feel like pressure, suffocation, or emotional overload, even when no actual danger exists. Stay with me, because the next idea explains why this reaction feels so automatic. The important point is that this response is usually not a deliberate choice. It is a learned nervous system reaction that has been reinforced over many years. Their body and mind have been conditioned to interpret deep emotional closeness as something that requires distance instead of connection. After reading that explanation, everything started falling into place. Especially because earlier that same week, I had been reading about a well-known principle in neuroscience. The idea is simple. The more often two experiences happen together in the brain, the stronger their connection becomes. Repeated experiences strengthen certain pathways, while unfamiliar ones slowly fade into the background. The brain constantly looks for patterns because patterns help it predict what will happen next. One famous study demonstrated this idea using young kittens. Researchers raised some kittens in environments where they saw only vertical stripes. As they developed, their brains became so specialized that later they struggled to recognize horizontal movement. Other kittens experienced only horizontal patterns and later had difficulty recognizing vertical ones. Their brains had adapted entirely to what they repeatedly experienced during early development. The lesson was remarkable. The brain does not simply observe reality, it learns what to expect, filters information, and builds its understanding of the world through repetition. Do not skip what comes next, because this same principle helps explain many confusing relationship patterns. When we apply this understanding to human attachment, especially avoidant attachment, many behaviors begin making much more sense. Emotional attachment starts forming during the earliest stages of life. For someone who develops avoidant tendencies, those first relationships are often marked by inconsistency. A caregiver may have been physically present while remaining emotionally distant. Basic needs may have been met, yet warmth, comfort, and emotional connection were inconsistent or missing altogether. Sometimes the caregiver was loving, other times they were unavailable, distracted, or emotionally shut down. Over time, the child develops a powerful internal belief. Emotional closeness does not always feel safe. Depending too much on someone else may lead to disappointment, rejection, or emotional withdrawal. The nervous system adapts to survive. Instead of seeking closeness, it learns to rely on distance. Instead of expressing emotions openly, it learns to suppress them. Independence becomes protection rather than preference. This is why the relationship with the primary caregiver matters so much. That early emotional environment becomes the blueprint for future relationships. If love was unpredictable, unpredictability begins to feel strangely familiar. If affection came and went without warning, inconsistency starts feeling normal, even when it causes pain. This next point surprises many people, so keep listening carefully. When an avoidant person creates distance and you respond by stepping away, their nervous system may recognize that pattern immediately. From the outside, it looks like rejection. Internally, however, it can feel strangely familiar because it reflects the emotional rhythm they experienced growing up. That does not mean it feels pleasant or healthy. It simply feels known. Human beings are naturally drawn toward what feels familiar, even when those familiar patterns create suffering. Familiarity often feels safer than something completely new. This helps explain why emotional reactions inside these relationships can seem so confusing. What one person experiences as painful abandonment may register in another person's nervous system as expected or even temporarily relieving, not because either response is right, but because both people are reacting through different emotional blueprints shaped years earlier. Looking back at more than 100 real stories from people who successfully reconnected with avoidant partners after breakups, one pattern appeared again and again. It was never endless chasing, emotional pleading, or trying to explain every feeling that changed the outcome. The biggest difference came from emotional stability after the breakup. Those who found peace within themselves stopped reacting from panic and began responding with calm confidence. That shift quietly changed the entire dynamic. Instead of feeding the familiar cycle of pressure followed by withdrawal, they introduced something completely different. They remained steady without becoming emotionally distant. They respected boundaries without playing games. They stayed calm without trying to force closeness. For someone whose emotional blueprint was built around inconsistency, this kind of quiet stability often feels unfamiliar in the most powerful way. It creates a different emotional experience, one that cannot easily be placed inside the old pattern. A story like Lauren's illustrates this change beautifully. She eventually reached a point where she accepted that she would be okay whether the relationship returned or not. She faced a difficult choice. She could continue moving forward with her own life, or she could make one final attempt to reconnect because during the breakup he had quietly said, "Maybe I just need some time." As she reflected on everything she had learned about these automatic emotional responses, she realized she might have misunderstood what had really been happening beneath the surface. Stories like hers encourage us to question many common assumptions about avoidant behavior. Sometimes what appears to be rejection is actually a deeply conditioned response that began long before the relationship itself. Understanding that does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does help explain why these patterns repeat so consistently. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: lasting change rarely comes from trying harder to be chosen. It comes from becoming emotionally grounded enough to choose yourself first. But what if what we often describe as emotional detachment is not actually detachment at all? What if it is something much more familiar to the nervous system? Imagine the pattern many people with avoidant attachment move through during a relationship. In the beginning, everything feels exciting. They genuinely want closeness. They want love. They believe this relationship will finally be different. For a while, everything seems natural. Then, almost without noticing, something begins to shift. Small moments of discomfort appear. Emotional expectations slowly start feeling heavier. Ordinary closeness begins to feel like pressure. Thoughts about needing space become more frequent. They start creating emotional distance, sometimes little by little, sometimes all at once. Eventually, they leave. Right after the separation, there is often a noticeable sense of relief. It can feel as though a heavy weight has finally been lifted. Their first reaction may be something like, "Now I can breathe again." But that feeling rarely lasts forever. As time passes, loneliness quietly returns. Doubt begins to grow. They start questioning themselves. Why does this always happen? Why do relationships keep ending the same way? What appears to be a simple cycle of getting close and pulling away is often something much deeper. From the beginning of the relationship until the breakup, they have been moving through emotional territory that feels unfamiliar to their nervous system. For them, emotional closeness is not the place that feels normal. Emotional distance is. Stay with me, because this next idea connects everything together. This is where the earlier comparison begins to make much more sense. Just as someone with an allergy reacts automatically to something that is harmless for others, an avoidant nervous system can respond to emotional intimacy as though it were overwhelming. That reaction is usually not a conscious choice. It is the result of years of conditioning that often began during early childhood. Many people who develop avoidant patterns grew up with caregivers who were emotionally inconsistent. They may have been physically present but emotionally unavailable. Sometimes they offered warmth and comfort. Other times they seemed distant, distracted, or emotionally absent. As those experiences repeated, the brain slowly built a powerful internal rule. Independence feels safe. Emotional dependence feels uncertain. Closeness begins to carry the possibility of disappointment, pressure, or emotional pain. Over time, this becomes the nervous system's normal setting. That is why when a relationship ends and emotional distance returns, it may not simply feel like freedom. It can feel like returning to familiar emotional ground. It is not necessarily happiness, it is recognition. It is the feeling of stepping back into an emotional environment the nervous system already understands. This may also explain why the period immediately after separation often brings temporary relief. It is not always a celebration of being alone. It may actually be a return to the emotional state that once helped them survive. Do not miss what comes next, because it explains why this creates such a powerful inner conflict. The story becomes even more complicated because human beings are not only shaped by experience, we are also naturally designed for connection. From the very beginning of life, people are wired to form emotional bonds, seek comfort, and build secure relationships with others. That means two powerful forces are operating at the same time. One side of the nervous system has learned that independence offers protection. The other side continues searching for closeness, because connection is a basic human need. These two forces constantly pull in opposite directions. One says, stay close. The other whispers, create distance before you get hurt. This internal conflict explains why avoidant behavior often seems confusing, even to the person experiencing it. A part of them sincerely wants love and connection, while another part automatically reacts as though intimacy is dangerous. This is why moments like Lauren's become so meaningful. When she finally reached the point of saying, I'll be okay either way, something important changed. The emotional pressure disappeared. The relationship stopped feeling like one person chasing while the other kept running away. Suddenly there was space instead of pursuit. There was calm instead of urgency. For someone whose nervous system expects pressure whenever closeness appears, that emotional atmosphere feels completely different, and that difference can quietly change everything. When emotional pressure fades, something unusual becomes possible. They experience both space and emotional safety at the same time. There is enough distance for their nervous system to settle, yet enough emotional security that connection no longer feels overwhelming. For many people with avoidant attachment, that combination is incredibly rare. Looking across many real relationship stories, this is often the point where meaningful reconnection becomes possible. Not because someone chased harder, argued better, or found the perfect words, but because the emotional environment itself changed. However, this is where many people misunderstand the lesson. They think the answer is simply pretending to detach. Real emotional detachment is not a strategy designed to make someone come back. It is not an act or a performance. It is a genuine internal shift. You truly reach a place where your emotional stability no longer depends on another person's choices. That is much harder than it sounds, because understanding something with your mind is very different from living it with your emotions. Most of us know certain habits are unhelpful, yet we still repeat them, not because we lack information, but because our attention follows deeply learned patterns rather than pure logic. Awareness is the first step. Emotional regulation is much more difficult. Lasting behavior change is harder still. The next example shows just how deeply these emotional reactions are wired into every human being. One of the clearest demonstrations comes from a famous psychological study, often called the still face experiment. In this experiment, a parent sits facing their infant and suddenly stops responding. Their face becomes completely still. They make no eye contact, show no emotion, and offer no comforting reactions. Within moments, the baby's behavior changes dramatically. At first, the infant tries everything it knows to reconnect. It smiles, reaches forward, makes sounds, and searches for any sign of emotional response. When nothing comes back, confusion quickly turns into distress. Soon the baby becomes upset because its sense of safety depends on emotional connection with the caregiver. This response is not random. Human beings enter the world relying on others to help regulate their emotions. A caregiver's voice, facial expression, and presence teach the child whether everything is safe. Those emotional signals become the foundation for future relationships. More recent demonstrations based on this same principle have shown similar reactions when parents briefly pretend to be emotionally unavailable or suddenly stop responding to their children. The lesson is powerful. Human beings are deeply affected by emotional connection from the very beginning of life. Understanding this helps explain why relationship patterns formed early can continue influencing adult behavior many years later. Recognizing these patterns is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding how deeply the nervous system remembers what once felt normal, even when that normal no longer serves us. Even when nothing dangerous has actually happened, an infant may still become upset simply because they are reading the emotional state of their caregiver. If the caregiver suddenly looks frightened, distant, or emotionally unavailable, the child often assumes something is wrong. Across these situations, one pattern becomes very clear. A young child is constantly watching the caregiver for emotional signals. Their nervous system depends on that connection to understand whether they are safe. This is where many people misunderstand avoidant attachment. It is not that people with avoidant tendencies have no need for emotional connection. Instead, their reactions often look very different on the surface. Rather than expressing distress openly when emotions become overwhelming, they tend to shut down or pull away. When emotional intensity increases or someone begins pursuing them more strongly, their nervous system often responds by creating distance instead of seeking reassurance. This is why one of the most influential attachment studies remains so important. Researchers observed young children as their caregiver briefly left the room and then returned. The most revealing part was not the separation itself, but the reunion afterward. Some children became upset when the caregiver left, but quickly settled once they returned. Others remained highly distressed even after reconnecting. A different group appeared unusually calm and independent. They did not cry much or move eagerly toward the caregiver. At first glance, they looked emotionally unaffected, but stay with me because the next discovery completely changed how psychologists understood those reactions. When researchers looked beyond outward behavior, they found something surprising. Even though these children appeared calm, their bodies were telling a different story. Their heart rates increased, their stress hormones rose, their nervous systems were clearly activated beneath the surface. They were not free from emotional distress. They had simply learned not to express it openly. This insight helps explain many adult relationship patterns. What looks like emotional detachment is often not the absence of feeling at all. It is a protective strategy developed during childhood, when expressing emotional needs did not consistently bring comfort, understanding, or safety. The nervous system adapted. It quietly learned a simple rule: do not reach too much. Do not show too much need. Do not depend too deeply. As those lessons became stronger, they carried into adult relationships. The pattern becomes familiar. As emotional closeness grows, the protective system becomes active. As emotional pressure increases, withdrawal follows. When the relationship finally ends, the nervous system often experiences temporary relief. This does not necessarily mean happiness. More often, it reflects a reduction in emotional overload. Many people mistake that relief as proof the avoidant person never cared. In reality, the nervous system has simply returned to a state it recognizes. Distance feels regulating because it has been familiar for years, not because it is deeply satisfying. Do not miss what comes next, because this explains why the cycle rarely ends there. Although emotional distance may temporarily calm the nervous system, human beings are not designed to remain disconnected forever. The natural desire for attachment continues to exist beneath the protective patterns. Even people with strong avoidant tendencies still carry a deep biological need for closeness. This creates an ongoing inner conflict. One part of them believes independence provides safety. Another part quietly longs for connection. These two forces often pull in opposite directions, creating confusion, loneliness, and emotional contradictions that are difficult to understand. Now consider what happens after a breakup. If the other person responds with panic, repeated messages, emotional pleading, or constant attempts to fix the relationship, it often reinforces the avoidant person's deepest expectation. Their nervous system receives the familiar message that closeness equals pressure. The old emotional pattern repeats once again. But if something different happens, everything begins to change. When the other person steps back, finds emotional balance, and stops reacting from fear, the emotional atmosphere shifts completely. This is not about playing games or pretending not to care. It is about becoming genuinely grounded. Suddenly there is space without emotional demand. There is respect without pursuit. That combination often feels unfamiliar to an avoidant nervous system because it does not match the emotional patterns it expects. Over time, that unfamiliar sense of calm can quietly challenge old beliefs about relationships. Looking across many real-life stories, this shift appears again and again. It is rarely the result of a clever strategy or a carefully planned technique. Instead, it happens when one person genuinely becomes emotionally stable after the breakup. Many people misunderstand this point. They assume the answer is simply doing nothing and waiting for the other person to return. Human emotions do not work that way. Emotional systems do not respond to formulas. They respond to consistency, emotional tone, and the feeling of safety created within the relationship. Most importantly, they respond to whether the old cycle is continuing or whether something healthier has quietly taken its place. This brings us back to a story that illustrates the idea clearly. After the breakup, the avoidant partner expected a familiar reaction. Based on past experiences, he likely assumed she would become highly emotional, repeatedly reach out, or desperately try to repair the relationship. That expectation formed part of his internal picture of how things always unfolded. Instead, he encountered something completely different. She appeared calm, she seemed emotionally steady, she accepted the situation without trying to force a different outcome. That unexpected response gently disrupted the story he had already written in his own mind. It was not dramatic, it was subtle, yet psychologically significant. The emotional script he expected no longer matched reality. After a breakup, many people assume an avoidant partner will quickly return once their perspective changes. In reality, avoidants often enter a period of withdrawal. This usually isn't about punishment or manipulation. It's their nervous system seeking safety through solitude, independence, and emotional distance. While this brings temporary relief, another force slowly emerges: the natural human need for connection. These two opposing drives, self-protection and closeness, create the core conflict of avoidant attachment. From the outside, this phase often looks like complete indifference. There may be no texts, calls, or visible emotion, but beneath the silence, emotional recalibration is taking place. Protective patterns remain active, while the deeper desire for connection quietly waits beneath them. Over time, curiosity often replaces certainty. Even without direct contact, avoidant individuals may still check social media, ask mutual friends how someone is doing, or quietly wonder about their former partner. As the comfort of distance fades, questions begin to surface. Was ending the relationship the right choice? Did I misunderstand what happened? Why doesn't this feel the way I expected? This growing curiosity isn't caused by pressure or persuasion. It develops because two emotional systems are now competing. One still seeks safety in distance, while the other begins missing emotional closeness. These forces continue pulling against each other, depending on stress levels and emotional regulation. Jenny's story illustrates this well. After the breakup, she didn't chase, beg, or demand answers. She didn't try to force conversations or manipulate his emotions. Instead, she focused on her own life and developed genuine emotional stability. Her distance wasn't a strategy, it reflected real personal growth. Because the reaction he expected never came, his nervous system encountered something unfamiliar. Over time, he reached out to reconnect. What mattered wasn't just the message, but its emotional tone: cautious, open, and uncertain. Instead of rushing back into the relationship, Jenny responded calmly. She didn't match urgency with urgency or pressure with pressure. She created emotional space, and that space disrupted the unhealthy rhythm they had repeated for so long. This reveals an important psychological pattern common in avoidant relationships. One partner seeks closeness and reassurance. The avoidant partner experiences that closeness as pressure and withdraws. The withdrawal increases the other person's anxiety, leading them to pursue even harder. The more one pursues, the more the other retreats. Eventually, this cycle becomes automatic. Neither person consciously chooses it anymore because both nervous systems expect it. The brain learns through repetition. When the same emotional sequence happens often enough, it becomes predictable. Pursuit leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal leads to pursuit. Conflict becomes familiar, even if it's painful. The brain begins predicting each step before it happens. Everything changes when that familiar pattern is interrupted. If the avoidant partner creates distance but the other person doesn't chase, the emotional script suddenly breaks. The brain, which depends on prediction, now faces uncertainty. It no longer knows what comes next. For someone who relies on predictable emotional patterns to feel safe, this uncertainty is significant. Instead of reacting automatically, the avoidant nervous system begins paying attention. Questions arise. Why isn't there pressure this time? Why does this situation feel different? That gap between expectation and reality creates the opportunity for genuine reflection. It's important to understand what this does and doesn't mean. Breaking the old cycle doesn't guarantee reconciliation or lasting change. It simply creates the possibility for a different outcome. Automatic reactions lose their grip because the familiar emotional script is no longer running. This pause allows awareness to replace habit. Instead of repeating old attachment patterns, both people have the chance to make more conscious choices. That's why quiet emotional stability is often more powerful than emotional speeches or repeated attempts to fix the relationship. The goal isn't to force someone back or create stronger emotions. It's to stop feeding the unhealthy cycle. When predictable reactions disappear, the emotional environment changes. And when the brain encounters something genuinely different, it naturally becomes curious. Real psychological movement rarely begins with dramatic gestures. More often, it starts with the quiet absence of the old pattern, a silent shift that creates room for reflection, healthier responses, and sometimes the possibility of a new beginning.